Wisdom of the Middle Way. Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamakarika. Translation and commentary by J. L. Garfield. Part 2, the text and commentary. Chapter 10, Examination of Fire and Fuel. This chapter, the only one in this set of chapters ostensibly addressing an external phenomenon, is in fact concerned entirely with a standard counterexample to the kind of arguments Nagarjuna offered in the two previous chapters on subjectivity in action and in perception. Recall that in those discussions Nagarjuna argues that subject and object cannot be intrinsically and distinctly identified as entities because of their mutual dependence. Buddhist schools asserting substantial identity in the context of dependent coorigination, such as Vaibhaśika and Sautrantika schools, use the example of fire and fuel to demonstrate the compossibility of substantial independent identity and dependent origination, as well as the possibility of the one-way dependence relation that these schools assert that actions and perception bear to the self. Just as fire depends on fuel, but not vice versa, they would argue, and just as fire and fuel have distinct identities despite the fact that the former depends for its existence on the latter, action and perception can depend on the subject, but not vice versa. Despite this dependence, proponents of this view would argue each relatum can be individually established as an entity. In this chapter, Nagarjuna undertakes the task of demonstrating that the example does not demonstrate these possibilities. 1. If fuel were fire, then agent and action would be one. If fire were different from fuel, then it could arise without fuel. The opponent does not want to assert the identity of fire and fuel, first, since it would contradict common sense, but second, since that, by the intended analogy, would identify agent and action, self and perception. On the other hand, if they are identified as intrinsically different as having distinct and independent essential identities, they should be able to arise independently. Fuel should count as fuel even if there were no fire. Fire should be possible without fuel. This follows from drawing the distinction at the level of intrinsic identity. Of course, distinguishing them conventionally permits their mutual dependence, but fails to establish the intrinsic identity intended by the reificationist. 2. It would be forever a flame. Flames could be ignited without a cause. Its beginning would be meaningless. In that case, it would be without any action. The second and third verses spell out the consequences of attributing inherent existence to fire. It would be independent of all conditions, including its fuel. It would burn causelessly, since there would be no condition under which it would not burn. So all fire would, in that case, be eternal. Moreover, it would not consume anything, having no connection to the presence or absence of fuel. Moreover, Nagarjuna asserts in the final two lines of X. 3. The activity of starting a fire would be nonsensical. 3. Since it would not depend on another ignition would be without a cause. If it were eternally in flames, starting it would be meaningless. 4. So, if one thinks that which is burning is the fuel, if it is just this, how is this fuel being burned? Nagarjuna now sets up a destructive dilemma: either the process of burning is identical to the fuel or different. In X. 4, he considers the possibility that they are identical. If so, he suggests, we have a problem in explaining how the fuel is consumed. The ordinary explanation of that is the presence of fire. But by identifying the burning process with the fuel, we have left the fire out of the picture. This analysis hence provides no explanation of combustion. After all, fuel by itself does not burn. It must be ignited. That is, fire must be introduced. If, as Nagarjuna argues in X. 5, they are completely different, there won't be any fire at all. For then the burning would be dissociated from and independent of the fuel, and the unburned fuel would not be consumed by the burning. We could make no sense of the transition from unburned to burned fuel. The general moral is that we cannot make sense of interactive processes such as combustion without attending to the mutual dependence of the interacting phenomena that constitute those processes. 5. If they are different, and if one not yet connected isn't connected, the not yet burned will not be burned. They will not cease. If they do not cease, then it will persist with its own characteristic. 6. Just as a man and a woman connect to one another as man and woman, so if fire were different from fuel, fire and fuel would have to be fit for connection. Here the opponent suggests that just as males and females are suited to connect in special ways in virtue of their particular anatomical structures, despite existing independently of one another, fire and fuel may be similarly suited to some special kind of connection. In that case, we would have the bizarre picture of fire being independent of fuel, yet peculiarly suited to coming together with it, and vice versa. Moreover, since on this model, fire and fuel are distinct from one another in nature, yet interactive, they preclude each other in the sense that causes and effects preclude one another, that is, in virtue of being connected yet incapable of simultaneous copresence, there must still be some account of how they connect, an account by no means easy to envisage. 7. And, if fire and fuel preclude each other, then fire being different from fuel, it must still be asserted that they connect. Fire and fuel hence appear to be mutually dependent. Indeed, the central point of Nagarjuna's argument is that they are. But here the question arises: don't they then have either to depend upon some third more fundamental thing or to be asymmetrically dependent, one of them established independently of the other? 8. If fire depends on fuel, and fuel depends on fire, on what are fire and fuel established as dependent? Which one is established first? If either is established as an entity first, without any reliance on the existence or nature of the other, that member of the pair would have a claim to being the basis in an asymmetrical dependency relation, and the opponent would have the counterexample necessary to refute the analysis in chapters 8 and 9. The most obvious form at such an asymmetric dependence could take would involve the dependence of fire on fuel. Nagarjuna argues that this is impossible to maintain. 9. If fire depends on fuel,